The following rather embarrassing story took place when I was around 19 years old. I'm a male who lives in Australia, and this was in the mid-2000s. It was Boxing Day, the day after Christmas for those of you in America, and there were plenty of good sales on at the local shopping center. Loaded with a wallet fat with cash, I got into my car and made the journey to the mall. Unfortunately, it seemed everybody else had the same idea. The car parks were chockers, and there seemed very little movement and plenty of cars circling with the same idea as me. To my left, a man middle-aged and slightly overweight and wearing too many clothes for the height of summer was gesturing to me. I ignored him and did a loop. On my return, he was still there. While I was stuck behind stopped cars ahead of me, he approached the passenger side window. He did not give me a good vibe. Shaved head, odd tattoos, an unkempt fake leather jacket, and gloves in the middle of summer. Afterwards, I could not for the life of me understand why I took the course of action I did. "Hey, mate," he said. "Merry Christmas. Reckon you could do me a favor and drive me to the Cash Converters?" Cash Converters was a combined pawn shop, quick loan outlet a couple of streets from the mall. Because I was full of Christmas spirit, or perhaps thinking I could take this gent if need be, or frustrated with trying to find a park and grateful for the interlude, I leaned over and opened the door. "Why not?" I said. He got in. We left the mall and he began to talk. "I just liquidated my business," he said. It had been apparently an electronic goods shop. I didn't believe it. His appearance and demeanor did not speak to a successful or even unsuccessful businessman. The hackles on my neck were raising, but I realized my first mistake had already been made. "I can sell you a cheap laptop," he said, "or DVD player. I've got to get rid of them. That's why I need to go to Cashy's. Stop by my business. It's close. I'll get you a cheap laptop." "Now, cheers though," I said, as nonchalantly as I could manage. I noticed that he had never put on his seatbelt. "Come on," he said. "It'll be brand new. Here's the place." It did not seem like the place. It just seemed like any old place. Grateful to stop, I pulled over adjacent to an Asian grocer. "My old stop is behind the grocer," he said. "I'll get you something nice." "Nah, man," I repeated. "And I think I'll leave you here." "What are you saying?" he said. "I'd like you to get out of the car, thanks." "You threatening me?" "No," I said, and realized I was still seatbelted in. He turned his whole body to face me. "I carry a knife for people like you try to threaten me." My mouth went dry. Thinking on the spot, I raised both hands as non-confrontationally as possible. "I'm not threatening you." Then he took a knife out of his jean pocket. It was a kitchen knife, nothing fancy, but big enough to chill me to the bone. "Well, how about you give me whatever cash you have in your wallet and I'll bring you back a laptop like I said." "You're robbing me?" I said, and my hands shook as I reached for the wallet. I had to push my hips to reach into my back pocket, and all I could think was that if he wanted to, now was the time he could stab me cleanly and take the car too if he wanted. "Not robbing you," he replied, and took the yellow $50 notes out of my pocket, pinching them as I held it open for him. "You'll have a Dell in 2 minutes." He put the knife back, opened the car door, and sauntered into the grocer. Calming myself, I locked the doors, reached for my mobile phone, and called 000, the emergency number here. I told the operator what had happened. The police station was one street over on the corner, so I assumed they would be on the scene quickly. "I'm going into the shop," I said, and I can't remember whether they approved of this plan or not. I walked into the grocer and asked if a guy had just walked through. They shook their heads and made as if though they spoke no English. I assumed he'd gone out the back. Long story short, the guy got away. The police attended in about 10 minutes, and once they had finished shaking their heads about how stupid I had been to accept a shifty-looking bloke for a ride, took my statement back at the station. That was more or less the end of it, and I'd lost several $100s for being a would-be good, if foolish, Samaritan. A few weeks later, the constable who took my statement called me. Some girls had been robbed by a fellow who matched the description that I'd given. He had sat down at a food court table with them in the same mall and told them that he had had a knife under the table and to hand over their money. The police said they'd call me back if they needed me to view footage or come in, but I never heard back a second time. The total failure of my instincts, which are usually quite good, bothered me for a long time afterwards, and I felt so bad about being such an easy mark I didn't tell anyone about it for a couple of weeks. Yet the thing that stayed with me was the odd psychological approach taken by this guy. He had tried to convince me that by robbing me, he was doing me a favor, and that he was acting in self-defense by pulling out a knife. I am not sure if that was for his benefit or mine, but either way, even when pumped with the Christmas spirit, I was very careful about who I helped from that point on. This happened in the late 90s in a medium-sized town in New England. It was the end of summer. I'd just turned 9. I got a Nintendo 64 for my birthday, and I was logging some serious hours of GoldenEye and Mario 64 on this beautiful summer day turned evening. My friend had gotten 120 stars and met Yoshi already, and here I hadn't even reached 70 when my mom came down the stairs. It was time to go pick up my younger brother from camp, and since my dad wasn't home from work yet, I'd had to go with her. I was mid-star here. I pleaded with her to let me stay home. "No, you can't pause it. I won't answer the door. If someone calls you're in the shower, you'll call them right back. I'm not a baby." My mom had let me stay home alone during the day a couple of times. I knew all the rules, but it was dark out and she didn't want to let me stay home alone all night. I pleaded with her. Finally, knowing my dad would be home in the next 30 minutes or so, she relented. Score. She must have ran into my dad in the driveway because it couldn't have been more than a minute before I heard the garage door open and my dad walk in. It was time to go pick up my older brother from football practice. I paused my game. There was a 0% chance I could convince my dad to let me stay home, even for the 20 to 30 minutes it would take to scoop my brother. We drove to the field and watched the last 15 minutes of practice under the lights. It would have been nearing 9 p.m. by the time we reached the driveway. Light poured out from the garage as the door went up. "Whoa, did you guys see that?" my brother exclaimed. "Some guy just ran through our backyard." Our house was set back from the road and surrounded by woods, so there definitely shouldn't be anyone in the backyard. I thought my brother was trying to scare me, and presumably so did my dad because he told him to pipe down. It was just a shadow. We live in a typical colonial house. The garage opened into a finished basement that was our game room. My dad and my brother went upstairs as I quickly shuffled back to my game. I flipped on the lights and immediately I noticed that the window pane on the door to the backyard had a big hole smashed through it. I called for my dad to come back downstairs. He went and checked the door. It was still closed and locked. He checked the rest of the basement. Another window that opened underneath our deck had a hole in it, and a brick was laying on the floor. My brother and I were in shock as my dad grabbed a bat and checked the first and second floors. No other doors or windows were broken. Nothing was missing. My dad called the police and they showed up a couple of minutes later. They checked around outside. Then they led us out to the back patio and showed us what had happened. Someone had punched a hole through the door pane so that they could reach in and unlock the door. They hadn't anticipated that it was actually a key, only deadbolt, meaning you needed a key to open the door from the inside as well. These used to be commonplace, but are no longer allowed because of the risk of trapping you in a fire. Next, he tried to kick the door in. There were clear footprints all over the door, but it held strong. After that didn't work, he had taken the screen out of the door under the deck, thrown a brick through the glass, undone the latch, and opened the window an inch or two. We must have interrupted him when we pulled into the driveway. My brother had actually seen a man run into the woods in our backyard. 2 more minutes and he would have been in. The really scary part is that all of our doors going in and out of the house were key-only deadbolts. If he would have gotten in and gone upstairs, if we gotten home 5 minutes later, he would have essentially been trapped in the house. He would have had to get past us to leave. We would have inevitably come face to face with the intruder as we went upstairs. Worse yet, he might have hidden somewhere in the house and tried to sneak out later, or do God knows what. Imagine checking your closet as a 9-year-old and actually finding someone. My mom and younger brother got home just as the police were finishing up. She told the cop that in the early afternoon she had seen a guy that looked out of place walking down the street. He was a youngish white guy with long, sandy blonde hair and a scruffy beard. The cops gave each other a look. There had been a string of burglaries one town over. In the last one, a young girl had been home alone and caught him trying to break in. She came face to face with him through a window. She ran and hid in the closet while she called 911. The guy actually still broke into the house and left muddy footprints all over. He didn't take anything. They thought maybe he was looking for the girl because it looked like he had checked under the beds. They believe he had fled in a truck stolen from a neighboring house that was burglarized the same day. The girl had described him as a young white male with a beard and long sandy blonde hair tucked up in a ponytail. Sure enough, the police came back the next morning. They had found the stolen truck, abandoned and out of gas a couple of streets over. It had some stolen electronics in the back, and apparently it also had a bunch of women's clothing that must have been taken from the houses as well. They didn't say underwear, but I assumed that's what they meant. They took pictures and lifted fingerprints. The cop told us he had most likely been scoping out the neighborhood when my mom saw him. He chose our house because there were woods all around it. He had probably waited in the woods and watched the cars leave before trying to break in. That was when it all started to dawn on me that if my dad hadn't gotten home right when he did, or if he had let me stay home while he picked up my brother, I would have probably been home alone when the guy tried to break in. This guy who had already broken into one house when he knew a little girl was home. Needless to say, I didn't want to stay home alone for a little while after that. A couple of days later, I was playing outside with the neighborhood kids. We went to hang out in the fort we built in the woods that overlooked my backyard and found 20 cigarette butts inside. The guy must have hidden out in my fort and watched our house all afternoon and evening until we saw both cars leave. If I hadn't gotten that Nintendo 64 for my birthday a few days earlier, I would have almost definitely been playing in the woods that day. I also wouldn't have wanted to stay home alone, though. So my Nintendo both saved my life and nearly got me killed. This is another story about how my usual spot-on instincts concerning people failed me spectacularly. It starts with an innocent night on the town with my coworker and friend, Georgia, or as I always called her, G. She's a teensy, pocket-sized elf of a girl who bears a close resemblance to a young Claire Danes, so not altogether unfortunate-looking. This was during a period when my boyfriend and I were separated. She was single too, so we went out to the local watering holes together quite often. It was that period of our lives where a night on the town meant dressing to the nines and then drinking, dancing, and flirting all night long. Now, as for myself, I very rarely drink. I get inebriated even less often. My limit is usually 1 mixed drink or 2 beers. I just don't like to put myself into a state where I am not in control, especially in a bar type of setting where you really need to be on your guard. For this reason, I usually drove whenever we went to the local watering holes. But that night, there was something wrong with my car. If I remember correctly, there was an exhaust leak. It wasn't something that would keep the car from running, but could possibly cause us to be pulled over. Not a scenario that someone who was a drunk passenger and potentially a drink or two in their system wants to invite. Since we didn't want to run the risk of having any run-ins with the law, we decided that G would drive. To make a long story short, G got spectacularly drunk and decided to leave with an ex that she happened to run into during that night. "Don't worry though," she says. "James said he would take you home." James was the nice-looking guy that she had introduced me to during the night. She told me that they went to the same church and she had known him since she was a kid, and he was a really nice guy. James and I had been talking and dancing and, yes, even flirting a little as the night progressed. Because I felt like we had gotten to know each other a little bit, and because he came with G's stamp of approval, not something she gave readily to anyone, I felt fairly comfortable accepting a ride home. Also, I was kind of put on the spot since G had already asked James and told me about it in front of him. I didn't want to insult a guy I potentially wanted to go out with. Looking back, I wish to whatever you worship that I just called a cab. On the way to my place, James dropped a lot of hints. I'm not ready to call it a night. I'd like to hang out a bit more. I could use another beer, etc. I casually told him that I was tired and ready for bed and thanked him for the ride. He asked for a kiss and I gave him a playful peck on the cheek, patted him on the arm, and shut the car door. The next day, I go out to run errands and the phone rings as I'm walking in the door. It's James wanting to hang out. I'm tired, so I say he can come over and we'll watch a movie and hang out for a short while. When I hang up, I see he's left a couple of messages while I was out. A little pushy, but okay, I guess. Maybe he just really likes me. We're sitting on the couch, watching a movie, and he goes from friendly companion to full-on makeout mode in 0.2 seconds. I mean, 1 second we're sitting on the couch at a comfortable distance, not holding hands or even touching each other. The next, he's practically on top of me, ramming his tongue down my throat. Oh no, dude, homegirl don't play that. So I'm telling him no, and he's acting like he doesn't get it. He's getting slightly more and more aggressively affectionate, and I'm starting to low-key panic. I don't remember what I said exactly, but I did eventually manage to get him out the door. Relatively unscathed, I thought, save for a copious amount of unwanted slobber. When I went to change for bed later, I found finger marks on my upper arms from where he gripped me so hard. The next night, I got approximately 10 calls from James. I didn't answer. He left voicemails. Every single time. This was before everyone had electronic leashes, aka cell phones. I myself only had a landline, so it was a lot easier to ghost someone back then. I figured I'd just not answer the phone and he'd eventually give up. Like most sensible people, right? Wrong. My phone rings at 4 a.m. Now, we know nothing good happens at that hour of the night. People don't call you up to chat, so when I was jolted out of sleep, I answered the phone automatically without even pausing to think or look at caller ID. It's James. What are you doing? Are you kidding me? I'm sleeping. No, you're not. Yes, I am. That's what most people do at 4 a.m. on a work night. Why is your living room light on then? You know that old saying, my blood ran cold? Well, I always thought it was a dramatic phrase to describe sudden fear, but you don't fully understand it until you experience it the way I did. He was calling me from right outside my front door. I was single, lived alone, and had no weapon. I was in the habit of leaving certain lights on at all times because, quite honestly, I'm afraid of the dark. I feel safer with lights on and even sleep with a bedside lamp on. I always have since I was a child. I don't remember what I said back, except that it involved lots of swearing, and it ended with him pounding on my door and calling me repeatedly for about a half hour or so. I eventually had to call the police to get rid of him. The next day, I sarcastically thanked G for the setup, and she was furious when she saw the bruises on my arms. She ended up admitting that she didn't really know James all that well, but they had been acquainted for a long time and he seemed like a nice guy. He kept up the psycho dialing for a while, but finally quit when G confronted him about my bruises and threatened to expose his behavior to their church community, and worse, his mother. I'd like to share a story about a once good friend turned horrible ex with you all. We met back in high school by chance. I was sitting in the library one early morning, doodling a little in a notebook when Tim came up to me. We shared a lot of common interests and I was deeply impressed by his drawing skills as he sketched a few draws for me. For the first few years, things were fine. We were great friends and got to know one another very well. He was the oldest of 3 children and the only boy in his family that was fairly religious. Not the say grace and Hail Mary religious, but definitely the say grace over the meal for 5 minutes in church every Sunday religious. I'm not really religious myself, but I wouldn't say I'm an atheist. I believe there is something greater than all of us, but I don't believe whatever it is demands we only talk to him in churches or over food. Now Tim was a nice guy, and I did develop a crush on him, but I always felt whenever I made a move he would back off and avoid it, so I never assumed it would ever evolve into anything more. Things, however, changed at the end of my junior year. At the time, my family's visa in the U.S. had been misfiled, and we were told we had 2 options: leave the U.S. for a year and reapply, or fight it and risk being deported. At the same time, my dad had been fired from his job for some BS reason, and my maternal grandmother was not doing well. This in turn affected my mom very badly because this was her last living parent, and she hadn't had the chance to help her father during his last few years. This left her with a lot of guilt and what-ifs and could-haves that plagued her endlessly. At the same time, I was entering my senior year, 3 credits short of graduation early, and my sister was in the 2nd year of college. There was also the fact that the United States was pretty much the only home I had ever known, so it was a question of when and not if. So my dad does the only thing he can think of. He asked some of his coworkers and family friends if they would take my sis and me in for a year so that I could finish high school at least. The family I ended up living for that year was absolutely wonderful. They had only a son who we were friends with, and they treated me like family from day one. The mom was Catholic, but she was one of the really great ones that wouldn't preach her faith into others or judge you by it. They had sort of adopted a lot of their son's friends who didn't have a nice home life, and when one of them came out as gay, she just smiled and said to him, "God doesn't make mistakes. You're exactly as you're supposed to be." I started to call them Mom and Dad version 2.0 really fast because I felt they deserved those titles too for everything they helped me with. They took me into their home and let me live with them absolutely free. All they asked was that I studied hard in school, did a few chores when they asked, and respected that there's no alcohol or anything illicit in their house. Easy. It was here, though, that Tim started to show a side that none of us liked. At first, it was just minor stuff. He would call almost daily to ask what I was doing and to hang out, and if I said I couldn't because of something, studying, wanting to spend time with other friends, then he would call my other parents to ask if it was true. I wasn't new to relationships, but because I was technically an illegal immigrant in the States at the time, I'd had so many things on my plate I didn't notice the signs. Things got even more stressful as my other father got prostate cancer and needed help getting to and from the hospital. I had to prioritize my school, other family, and then boyfriend and friend with other responsibilities. For whatever reason, Tim didn't like that. He started demanding I spend more time with him, that whenever I was free to go over to his house and spend the day. I liked his family, they were nice people, but I am also an introvert, and if I don't have at least a little bit of solo time, I can't recharge proper. Soon, the pressuring started. It was strange. It was to go to church. His church. He kept saying how it was important and how I'd feel great going there and love it, and it was a Christian duty. This was right when the whole Muhammad drawing controversy happened, and I've never found comfort in religions, much less the kind where they pressure you on Christian duties. I avoided it for a while until I finally got the courage to tell him I wasn't comfortable with the idea of going to church, and given everything I need to ensure to graduate as well, my other family's own problems, I didn't feel I had time to add church to it. You would think it was okay, but not for Tim. He got super offended and started demanding that I give a better reason as to why not. He even went as far as to go to my other mother and talk to her about the idea of us going to church. She thankfully told him that was my choice, and regardless of his feelings about it, he needed to respect that. Then, the creep factor went up a notch. He started showing up uninvited both at my home and school. He had graduated at the time and was in college. It was easy for him to get into school grounds since he had gone there too. He would go looking for me all over campus, try to guess which classes I would take to find me. Both my other parents and even other brother even caught him once trying to peek into my room through the blinds to see if I was home after asking if I was really there or not. My other mother told him that was inappropriate, while my other father told him to never do that again because it was unacceptable. My brother, at first, made a few jokes about him, calling him ogles for trying to peep in, but after he caught Tim doing it again at 2 in the morning while I was asleep, he told him he was officially going into creepers territory and that he would beat him down if he didn't stop. I stopped laughing whenever Tim was around. I became more and more reserved to the point where everyone but Tim commented that I didn't seem happy in the relationship at all. And it was weird too, because the furthest that we'd ever even really gone was holding hands. He wouldn't even let me kiss him on the cheek in private. The final straw came when I was over at his place trying to figure out how to tell him I wanted to go back to being friends, when his mom suddenly said that it was so nice that we were following tradition. I asked her what she meant, and she told me that she and her husband had been high school sweethearts and married right after high school, and that Tim was doing the same. I full-on panicked. We hadn't dated long. We barely did anything that could be called being a couple, and I was heading back to Denmark after I graduated. I was only 18 and nowhere near the age where I felt ready to marry, not to mention how conflicted I was feeling about the relationship. I couldn't see this ever working out. I was starting to see that our relationship as a couple was more toxic rather than healthy. The first chance I had, I told him in private that I didn't feel like this was working out. I still wanted to be kind and not embarrass him in front of his family. I've never felt breakups should be public displays. Tim did not take this well. He pleaded and begged, saying if I just tried to go to church with him, I would see the light. Not sure how, since he knew I didn't want to, that I was ruining his family's tradition. He tried to argue that if we married, I could stay in the States, but I didn't want to marry for a green card. In the end, we both parted in tears and with other things unresolved. A few weeks pass in silence as I focus on school and just recharging. I'm getting ready to graduate and dealing with the reality that my biological parents won't get to see it because of our finances weren't very good at the time, and try to focus that my other family and sister will at least see me get my diploma. Then, joy upon joy, as my mom wrote to me to say she's going to visit for a week to see my graduation. I wanted both of them there, but was so thankful that at least one of them would be there. I happily told my friends about it, and we all started talking about who we'd be giving our graduation tickets to. I can't remember how many we had, but I remember I had a few left over after inviting my mom, other parents, and 2 brothers, and one of my friends asked if Tim was coming. I wasn't sure if I wanted him there after what had happened, but at the same time, I had been to his back when we were friends. And like an idiot, I reached out and asked him if he wanted to come as a friend. Tim became irate, ranting how I was being selfish. His anger was so explosive that it shocked me, and he finished it by saying to me, "There are 5 priorities in life: God, family, health, school, and friends. In that order, but you don't seem to get that. Your order is family, friends, school, health, and then God. You need to sort yourself out." At the time, I was too shocked to react at first because I muttered a small, "But that is how I see things. They are what matters," before walking away. I gave my extra tickets to a classmate who needed them more because he had one of those massive, close-knit families. Graduation comes, and I received my diploma with cheers and pride, knowing that which a high school diploma doesn't mean a whole lot. It is my first set of proof that I can dedicate the time needed to learn something. I toss my cap, look for it after, and immediately go off to get the real thing. Our school kept them hostage, so we would have to behave during the ceremony and look for family. When I found them, I can instantly tell you that something was off. They smile at me, but clearly something is bothering them. I asked what was wrong, but they just brush it off, making an excuse that someone had one of those stupid annoying horns with them. I didn't believe them, and in the end, my mom told me that Tim had shown up. She knew a little bit about the drama going on and figured he was just there to say congratulations. Well, spoiler, he wasn't. He said he needed to talk to her about me and how I needed to be saved. that I was destined for eternal torment because I wasn't embracing the church or what my womanly duties were meant to be. She asked him what he meant, and he said to obey her future husband. She lost it, and I did too when she told me. We were not engaged, and even if he was, I am not some dog that's meant to follow orders. In the words of a pastor I once had, God made Eve from Adam's rib, not from his head, for she was not above him, not his foot, for she is not behind him, but his side, for she is equal, and so that he can place his arm around her to protect her when needed. I'm not religious, but I've always liked the way of explaining Adam and Eve. So to hear that Tim thought I was his to order around made me furious. The last I spoke with him, I let him have it. I yelled and threatened, telling him if he ever thought he had any rights to decide what I deemed important in my life, that he had another thing coming. He tried to argue that I needed to be saved, and finally I just screamed. I screamed that I didn't need to be saved, that I didn't want to be saved, and I'm happy as I am. He stared at me, saying that I didn't mean it. I said I did, and that if he kept pushing as he was, then I didn't want to speak with him again. I told him it was making our friendship unbearable, and if he didn't learn to respect people's opinions on religion, the next relationship he would be in wouldn't work either. He got angry and said that I was destined for hell, and in a fit of rage I told him, our relationship is hell. You've made it that way. To which I left immediately. I lived in the States for a month after that, and we didn't talk about it. His family tried to plead for me to apologize to Tim for what I had said, but I told them that I had meant it because of his constant bullying. After that, I wasn't welcomed at their house anymore, not that I ever even wanted back. Tim tried to reach out to me again a few years later with some sort of over-religious story and how I was like the main character. I told him I would like it if we could be friends, but if he was going to send me religious texts like before, he needed to delete my contact info. We haven't spoken since. He ended up dating a dear friend of mine a few years later, only to mess it up the same way he had ours. My friend had asked if I was okay with them dating, to which I told her honestly that that wasn't for me to decide. Just because he was my ex, it didn't give me any right to say that he could or couldn't date, but reminded her to not let him bully her about religion. She had just left the Mormon church. To this day, I think he's still single and trying to find some girl that he can save with religion. And while I wish for him to find his special someone someday that meets his needs willing, I will say this, Tim, I'm glad we'll never meet again, as an ocean is now between us. So I was walking through the town center with my husband. We were just talking about what bills needed paying, etc. I looked over from me, and straight in front of me was a man. This is no ordinary man. This is a man whose face is etched into my brain, in my memory, a memory I locked away many, many years ago. When I was around 8, my aunt, who had a few learning disabilities, lived on her own. She was not very clean, lived in a one-bedroom flat with around 5 cats. It stunk, it was dirty, but I used to go by to help her tidy up and look after the cats. There was a man who lived in the upstairs flat, we'll call him C. C also had cats, and his cats had kittens. C had befriended my aunt and used to come talk to her. They seemed like good friends, but I didn't like him too much. One day while I was there, C turned up. He had been up feeding kittens for most of the night as the mum cat was rejecting them. He said he was tired, and if he fell asleep, to wake him in 2 hours to feed the kittens. 2 hours went by, and my aunt said we need to wake up C so he can feed them. My aunt tried to wake him, shaking. All he did was grumble and tell us to get away from him while he was sleeping. My aunt started to laugh, thinking he was joking, and started pulling at his foot. She hit down on his foot and shouted, "See, you need to get up and go feed your kittens." All of a sudden, he jumps up, no emotion on his face, looked straight towards me, and started to march his way across the room. I tried to run for the door, but he managed to catch me around my neck. His hands went tighter and tighter. I wanted to scream and cry. I wanted my mum. I thought I was going to die as he raised me off the floor with his hand still around my neck, slowly creeping up the wall. I was 8, around 56 pounds, so was not big at all and very petite. I could feel the life being drained from me. All of a sudden, I felt my body sliding quickly down the wall. I felt a very sharp pain at the top of my legs where it meets your bum and realized that he had slammed me down on a radiator that was on the wall. And with that, he let go, straightened himself out and said, "I'm going to feed the kittens," and left. I was crying so hard, I just wanted my mother. My aunt just stood there with her mouth open. She didn't try to help, but just stood there screaming while he did it. Funny thing is that I knew she was screaming, but in that few minutes that it took to happen, it was like silence for me, pure silence. All I remember is just looking C in the eyes, thinking I'm never going to see my mom or brother and sisters again. My aunt rang my mom. She got a taxi straight to her house. My stepdad came and went to find C. He had disappeared. No one knew where he was. For 2 weeks, my stepdad waited outside the flats, but he didn't come back. Some cat protective people came and got the cats and kittens and took them away. The police showed up as my mom was ringing them, and a neighbor had heard the commotion and rang them as well. They took statements and took us home. I also had to have photos taken of my injuries around my neck and just under my bum, where I had a big gash from the side of the radiator. I had to have it dressed by a nurse for a while, but it was okay and fortunately just left a scar. She went to court, and luckily I didn't have to attend because of my age. All he got was 1 year conditional discharge. I was told this means if he did anything within a year, he would have this charge too, put onto whatever the charge was. That was not justice. It was a joke. I was scared to leave my home. Didn't want to play out with friends. My aunt went on not to talk with family and actually marry that man. It only lasted about 6 months. I wanted so much to wreck the wedding. I hated him, I hated her, I hated them. I hated them to the point I cried. Why should they be happy when they stole my light? My light was now dark. It divided a lot of the family. It took a long time for nightmares to stop and the anxiety he was going to come finish what he started. I put it away in a box, never wanting to open it again. And there he was, stood right in front of me, right there. I wanted to go slap, beat him, but also wanted my husband to just hug me tight and tell me I was okay. As I look back, he looked at me, but I don't even think he knew who I was. But I certainly knew who he was. As quick as I saw him, he was gone. I stewed on my feelings for a few days, but I think it's time to put them back in the box, where they belong. This was a few years ago. I was 23 and I just graduated university with my journalism degree. I graduated a semester later than my friends and as a result was still slinging beers at a restaurant while most others had bagged internships or were working their 9-to-5s. I was frankly feeling a little lost and desperate to be doing something for my career. Enter my series of poor life choices. I was working a day shift at the restaurant, so bartending and serving all the lounge tables. It was a really quiet afternoon and this stout old man, probably between 70 and 80 years old, was brought up to my section with 2 menus. I took his drink order and he told me he had a friend coming soon, so he would wait to get food. After a half hour, no one shows. I started to feel bad for him and I still had my managerial access even though I was bartending, so I offered him an appetizer on the house while he waited, but he looked dejected and refused. At this point, he was the only customer, so I sat with him to keep him company. He told me about how his friend was a photographer and she had offered to take his photo as reference for him to draw a self-portrait from. He said that his neighbor always calls him the Thinker, and she had painted his deck for him, so he wanted to give her the drawing of himself in the pose as a gift. But he sighed and said he didn't think his photographer friend would be joining him after all. He got this sad look on his face and said, "It's hard to find people to help with this. Once you get to my age, all your friends are dead." Immediately, I jumped up and said, I'm actually a photographer. I just graduated with a degree majoring in photojournalism. I can take your photo. Do you have a camera? We can take it right now." He said he wanted the photo to be realistic, though, with a background of trees, so he refused. And here's where I get stupid. I tell him that we can meet the next day. It's my day off. We can go to a nearby park and I'll bring a professional camera. In my head, I'm thinking that this is great. I have a reason to use my expertise to help someone instead of hate-watching the Kardashians all day while everyone else is at an office. We agree to meet at a cafe by the park first to have a coffee and talk, then we go take the photos. I went home ecstatic, thinking I did a good deed and I made a new old man friend who can share his wisdom or whatever. We met at that cafe and talked for a while. He kept insisting that he would pay me $300, but I told him I just wanted to help him. He was getting increasingly sheepish, though, and saying he didn't want to get embarrassed. Alarm bells were ringing in my head, but I couldn't figure out why. He was acting really strange and fidgety, but I chalked it up to him not liking being photographed. As we were finishing the coffee, he admitted that the neighbor didn't really paint his deck, but she actually gave him a topless photo of herself, which was why he wanted to give her the portrait. He had a weird look in his eye, and I was immediately uncomfortable and put off by his demeanor and the sudden story change. At this point, I just wanted this whole thing over with, so I said something stupid like, "Oh wow, well that's nice. Anyway, let's get going." I had walked to the cafe since it and the park are only about 2 kilometers away from my house, but he said he couldn't walk to the park, so we can take his car. So, I got into his car? I know. When we're inside, he takes out a photo album and says, "The topless picture she gave me is in here. Do you want to see it?" So I said nope, not at all, and I proceeded to not get out of his car. I truly cannot explain myself. He starts driving, and we're looping through this giant park. I keep pointing out places where he can perch to do the thinker pose, but he says it's not secluded enough, says he doesn't want to be embarrassed. At this point, I finally realized what a ridiculously insane situation I put myself in. I'm a young, defenseless woman in a car with a man I don't know who is looking for secluded places in the woods. Great. I wondered what photo of me they'd use in my obituary. I finally convinced him to pull over next to a bench. I had my body half out the door before he said, "Wait, how should we do this?" I gave him a confused look and asked what he meant. "Well, should I take my clothes off in the car or out on the bench?" If I was a cartoon, my jaw would have been on the floor. I kept the door open and my foot outside and asked what he meant, and he said, "Well, I told you I wanted it to be realistic. In the sculpture, the thinker is naked. I thought you understood." Sir, please. At no point was that a discussion, and I have already basically invited myself to be ended here. I say as much in nicer terms since I still don't want that to come to fruition. So he tried this sad act and said that this is why he didn't want to be embarrassed. He offered to pay me $500. I say a series of no, nope, and never, but I'm still trying to get out of here alive, so I tell him that if he stays fully clothed, I will take a photo of him on the bench in the pose and email it to him. He can imagine the rest. He put the sad act on again, but agreed. As I'm leaving, he insists on giving me a $100 bill for my trouble, even though I continue to say no. But he puts it in my hand. I half ran the entire way to the university bar and spent the day drinking and feeling violated and awful and confused and upset with myself and with him. I spent the dirty money on fancy whiskey for my boyfriend because I didn't want it. I never sent him the photos. But wait, there's more. Months later, I went on a trip to the mountains with some friends, 2 of whom I worked with at the restaurant. I had moved SD cards around and put an old one in my point-and-shoot camera, honestly forgetting about those photos because I never even looked at them. One of my coworkers was scrolling through the photos we'd taken while we were eating, and she scrolled all the way to the beginning and said, "I recognize that man." Turns out, he did the exact same thing to her 5 months prior to my idiocy, at the same restaurant, only she did let him get down to his skivvies. A week and a half ago, my friend Mary and I were chilling at my apartment around 11 p.m., not doing much, and so we decided to go play pool at a local, smaller-than-average bar about 5 miles at most from my place. I'd been there before, and it was never really busy most nights, and it was more my type of bar because the setting was much more intimate and you could actually have a conversation with the person next to you. We met this one bald guy who was playing pool when we got there, and we asked if we could join him. He seemed like good company, and we were having fun playing pool. I want to note this guy was not at all creepy. He seemed like a pal. Fast forward to a cigarette break outside. An average-looking guy approaches the three of us and starts striking up a convo with me. Honestly, I had quite a bit to drink, so I really don't remember much, but my friend Mary said that he seemed into me. He seemed harmless, so I gave him my Facebook info. Why not? Long story short, we exchanged texts over a period of like 5 days. I learned that he had previously worked as a vet tech. That's what I do currently. He asked me out. I was a little skeptical because I had just gotten out of something not too long ago, but I've never really had the chance yet to date someone who loves animals as much as me, so I thought it might be cool to see how things sort of align. On Saturday evening, he picked me up to take me out for some food. We had an okay time, but I wasn't super feeling his energy. I got this weird gut feeling, and my mama always told me to follow my gut. My gut has never been wrong, and I'm so glad I listened to it this time. This guy is 32, and I'm 23. I've dated a few older men. I don't go looking for older guys, but it just panned out that way. And he just gave me this predatory vibe the whole time. I can't really explain it, but it's similar to how someone would look at a meal after not eating for a long time, and it gave me chills. I bailed early that night so I could work the next day at 9 a.m. He sent me about 20 messages overnight up until about 4 in the morning via Facebook that evening about how he was so happy to meet me, yada yada. 20 messages. It freaked me out, so I blocked him. I thought that was the end of it, but no. Fast forward to last night, I was just minding my business, playing some Mass Effect and Andromeda, romancing some blue alien chicks, hanging out with my dog. I just so happened to walk out of my room. I wanted to note that it was extremely hard to hear people knocking on my door when I'm in my room with the door closed. It's all the way across my apartment, so I walked out and heard knocking. I was expecting no one, as I was planning on lounging under a rock my entire day off, but I peeked through the hole in the door and guess who was knocking? I have no idea when he got there. I sprinted into my room, adrenaline pumping and pantless, trying not to have a panic attack. I didn't know this guy. Why was he at my door? Bad news too was I had broken my phone recently and my roommate had moved out the same weekend to move in with her boyfriend, so I legit thought I'm gonna die here tonight, covered in Cheeto dust with hairy legs. This was about 9 p.m. at night. I called my friend Mary, the girl who had been in the bar with me, who booked it over to my apartment from her place, which was about 15 miles from mine. He had been knocking on my door for about 45 minutes when she showed up. She filmed him so we have his face on camera, and eventually she convinced him to leave, mainly because she threatened to call the cops. Once she got to my door, I opened it and found a bag of kiwis, which was kind of random, and a small bouquet of flowers hung on my doorknob. Oh, and he also tried to give my friend some dank, if you know what I mean, in exchange for talking to me. What the heck? I mean, you really can't barter when it comes to me, a living, breathing human. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let's Read Official, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. and join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located on both Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.